I'm a 27-year-old woman who has lived in the shadow of my younger brother Mike, 21, my entire life. From the moment he was born, my parents, especially my mother, 50, transformed from loving parents into completely different people. My mother became the stereotypical boy mom that people mock online, while my father, 50, though still showing me some love, never had the courage to stand up to my mother's blatant favoritism. My brother wasn't special needs or had any particular reason to require extra attention. He was just born male, and that seemed to be enough for my mother to discard me entirely. Mike grew up knowing he was a favorite and frequently used this to his advantage, taunting me and framing me for his misdeeds. He developed into a spoiled, manipulative man-child who expects everyone to bow to his wishes. The only person who consistently stood up for me was my grandfather, 76, who lives across the country. He shares a special bond with me as I remind him of his late wife, my grandmother. He's always been vocal about disapproving of my parents' treatment of me and their obvious favoritism toward Mike. The favoritism extended to every aspect of our lives. My parents missed countless important events in my life, my ballet performances, high school graduation, and university graduation, all for Mike's activities. They even used my college fund, claiming it was spent on fire-related expenses, only for me to discover years later that the money was given to Mike to buy a car and house. During my time at public university, I met Lucas, who started as my best friend before we began dating. Through him and other friends I made, I finally found the strength to move out of my parents' house. Both Lucas and I have become successful in our respective fields. A year ago, Lucas proposed. Being private people, we didn't announce it on social media. When I told my parents about the engagement, they dismissed it with a casual, "That's nice," making me wonder if they even listened. We planned a simple but elegant ceremony, and despite my reservations, Lucas convinced me to invite my parents and brother. They never responded to the formal invitation. Whenever I tried to discuss wedding plans during visits, my mother would interrupt with stories about Mike's achievements. When I specifically mentioned having an unmovable event date, my mother immediately declared they couldn't attend because Mike had an important football game that day. Rather than argue or explain further, I decided to be petty and simply accepted their absence without explicitly reminding them it was my wedding day. The wedding was perfect. My grandfather proudly gave me away, and we were surrounded by loving friends and family. When relatives asked about my parents' absence, I truthfully said they were at Mike's game. The situation exploded when one of my paternal aunts posted wedding photos on Facebook with a caption criticizing my parents, particularly my mother, for missing the wedding. The post went viral in their community, leading to public shame and backlash. My grandfather personally visited my parents and berated my father to the point of tears. This seems to have been a breaking point, as my father is now threatening divorce unless my mother makes amends with me. My phone has been flooded with messages from my mother, initially hostile and threatening, then devolving into desperate pleas and self-pity. My maternal aunts and their friends are criticizing me for not explicitly telling my mother about the wedding, claiming she's devastated about missing it. However, I did send formal invitations and attempted to discuss it multiple times. My family is now divided. The majority support me, while my maternal aunts shame me, and my maternal grandparents insist I forgive my mother's supposed atonement. Throughout my life, I've tried to go no contact several times but face harassment and shame from my maternal family members. Previous attempts to expose their mistreatment at age 14 resulted in severe punishment and gaslighting. Only now, with Lucas's support, do I feel confident enough to stand my ground. We live an hour away from my parents' small town, and they don't have my new address. The situation has created a complex family dynamic where years of favoritism, emotional abuse, and neglect have finally come to light, forcing everyone to confront the reality of my parents' treatment of me. It all started when my brother tried to break into my apartment to steal cash. Shockingly, my mother defended him, claiming that siblings should share their belongings. This wasn't the first time my family had treated me unfairly, But this time felt like the final straw. I decided to move to a new place and keep my location a secret from them. Reflecting on the past, it became clear how much my parents favored my brother. They had bought him a car for his 16th birthday and even purchased a house near his college during his freshman year. Meanwhile, they had lied to me about my own savings fund, telling me the money was gone. In truth, they had kept it intact, intending to use it later for my brother. The betrayal stung deeply, and their preference for him over me had always been obvious. When I shared my story online, I was met with skepticism. Some people accused me of fabricating everything for attention. To those who doubted me, I explained that I was overwhelmed and emotionally drained when I first wrote about it. I wasn't trying to entertain strangers or invent drama. I was venting about real pain. I couldn't believe people would go out of their way to send me messages accusing me of lying. I didn't expect sympathy, but basic decency would have been nice. As I recounted my experiences, I realized I had left out a few details. For example, the wedding invitation I had sent to my parents was clear. It was a formal wedding, not some casual event they could brush off. Despite this, my mother's side of the family hadn't attended. Some were too busy, while others gave excuses and simply mailed gifts instead. It wasn't that they had serious conflicts. They just didn't prioritize being there. A few days after posting online, I took a break to process everything. Lucas, my husband, has been my constant support. I don't know what I would do without him. He helped me realize that the way I clung to my toxic family wasn't healthy. I hadn't cut contact with them completely because deep down, I still longed for their approval. As much as I hated admitting it, I had always hoped they would eventually treat me better. But Lucas pointed out the harsh truth. They wouldn't change, and continuing to chase their affection was only harming me. I finally decided it was time to move on. I committed to starting therapy and cutting off contact for good. This wasn't just a rash decision. I needed to protect my peace. After reflecting for days, I reached out to my father. I told him if he wanted to discuss things, we could meet in a neutral location, but only with my mother and brother present. He agreed immediately, and the next day we met at a park. His siblings, my aunts and uncles, came along, likely to prevent things from escalating. When I arrived, I noticed how worn out my father looked. His eyes were red and puffy, as if he had been crying. My mother appeared angry and embarrassed, but my brother looked completely indifferent. I sat down and calmly explained how their favoritism had affected me. I told them their neglect and emotional abuse had finally pushed me to the point where I didn't want them in my life anymore. As I spoke, my mother tried to interrupt several times, but my aunt shut her down. I asked them why they had treated me so poorly all these years. My father couldn't give me a straight answer. He just kept crying and apologizing. My uncle scolded him, but that didn't make a difference. Surprisingly, my mother admitted that she simply disliked me. She said it as if it were a minor inconvenience, rather than the foundation of years of mistreatment. As for my brother, he admitted he liked the attention he got from making me miserable. It was a game to him. I pressed further, asking why they hadn't come to my wedding. They insisted they had never received an invitation. I pulled out my phone and showed them the messages I had sent, but they denied seeing them. Eventually, the truth came out. My brother had intercepted the invitation when it arrived at their house. He tore it up and deleted my messages to keep them from knowing about the wedding. He thought it wasn't important enough compared to whatever plans they had at the time. Lucas, understandably furious, almost punched my brother, but I held him back. Surprisingly, my parents were angry at Mike for once. He tried to play the victim, crying and throwing a tantrum, but I felt no sympathy. When my mother tried to brush everything off as a misunderstanding, I lost it. I told her that tearing up the invitation didn't erase years of neglect and abuse. They had known about the wedding. I had talked about it repeatedly. They chose to ignore it. My mother's response made my blood boil. She told me she thought I was imagining things and making up stories to get attention. She didn't even believe Lucas loved me enough to marry me. At that point, I was shaking with rage. I told them exactly how I felt. My father was a weak man who let his wife dictate his life. My brother was a spoiled parasite who would accomplish nothing. And my mother was a narcissist who didn't deserve an ounce of respect. I shouted at my mother to sit down and listen for once, and she looked ready to explode. I don't remember everything I said afterward. I was so furious I couldn't stop talking. The entire park must have heard me. I ended by telling them I was cutting them out of my life permanently. On the way home, I broke down in a panic attack. Lucas and my friends helped calm me until we pulled over in a parking lot. I slept for hours when I got home, drained by everything that had happened. I didn't expose them publicly on Facebook, but I found another way. I compiled every nasty message and insult from my mother and sent them to the leader of her church. It's a small, tight-knit community, and her reputation there meant everything to her. Sure enough, the scandal spread quickly and she was shunned. Some family members messaged me afterward, criticizing me for embarrassing my mother, but I blocked them all. Even my father sent a long apology, saying he planned to divorce her. I told him I didn't want to reconcile with him either and blocked him. Lucas has been incredibly supportive, and I'm grateful to have him by my side. For the first time, I feel free.